So, good afternoon, everybody. And first of all, let me thank Mr. James for inviting me today, and thank to all of you who decided to join us attending this talk about ancient Egyptian myth-making architecture. So let's start. And today's talk will be divided into two parts, responding to the alchemic says of Solver at Coagula. And in the first part, before entering the ancient Egyptian world, I'll take some moments to introduce you some key concepts that will be crucial in order to grasp the essence of the theme we're going to deal with. First of all, I'm going to spend a few words about imaginative consciousness or cognitive imagination, which in my opinion is one of the sources of knowledge of the ancients. We'll then define what an image is, and finally we'll move to the core element of this research, namely the Mundus Imaginalis. After this brief introduction, we will deal with another crucial aspect regarding ancient architecture, namely that of being a real axis mundi, a link between the lower and the upper world. And later on, after this, let's say, general prologue, we will focus on ancient Egypt, and we're going to talk about the two essential myths regarding the afterlife, and we will see how they were crucial in shaping royal and private tombs of New Kingdom. And then we will spend some words on sarcophagi. In the second part, we're going to join all these elements in the analysis of one kind of royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Well, nowadays we are accustomed to a nosological dualism opposing basically two sources of knowledge. On the one hand, we have five senses and physical perception of the surrounding reality, while on the other hand, we know by means of concepts of the intellect, sort of a priori notions. Ancient civilization would be probably horrified by this dichotomy, and they would probably feel the lack of a third cognitive method, namely the imaginative consciousness or cognitive imagination. Cognitive imagination is the ability of creating images, a skill that I think was surely known and owned by the Egyptians. And not differently for Australian aborigines, for example, that in dreamtime went along the world singing and then creating the tangible reality. Ancient Egyptians believed that while writing hieroglyphs, they were creating another reality. They were in fact entering the Mundus Imaginalis. For the ancients, images were endowed with the Sophia. They were at the same time product and vehicles of wisdom. So let's consider a first example of this ability of creating images. It is common knowledge that ancient Egyptians had a quite distinctive way of representing reality. Everything had to be represented as directly as possible without any potential confusion. And this is because what was depicted would become real and existing. During the Old Kingdom, for example, it was common to represent the private tomb owner with a staff in his left hand and a scepter in his right one. No problem when it should be facing east, as in this case, but some troubles come when it should be facing west. In order to respect the symmetry, the right hand would be projected forward holding the staff, while the left one would be relaxed holding the scepter. But in so doing, the symbolic disposition of scepter and staff would not be respected. Thus, some artists began to adapt the morphology of the body by swapping left and right hand and feet in order to respect that symbolic layout. And moving to another example, even more striking, in the tomb of Iti and Nephiru, discovered in 1911 by Ernesto Schiaparelli in Gebelin, and now reconstructed in Museo Egizio of Turin, there were depicted scenes of agricultural life. This particular scene, for example, represents workers transporting grain to the silos, and we notice that the bag upon the mule's back is represented upside down. I think it is quite easy to understand the reason of this apparently meaningless feature. As we said before, a depiction should be as clear as possible in order to represent the subject without any kind of possible misunderstanding. So the mule is carrying two bags in the reality, and then two bags should be depicted. And the only way to represent them both is to draw the back one reversed upside down. And in so doing, the mule would be happy and would have the chance of to live in the Mundus Imaginalis with its proper equipment made and consisting of two bags. The theoretical background of ancient Egyptians iconography is quite easy and lies on the fact that of a picture exists what is evident, what can be seen. It goes without saying that, let's say, anatomic accuracy was not within the intentions of a pictorial representation. And therefore, why so much struggle to depict a scene? I think we could find a hint of the importance of pictorial representation in the word itself used to define the hieroglyphic writing. Hieroglyphic writing will sesh Medu Nedger or just Medu Nedger, which means writing of God's speech. The first sign on the left is means writing. Then we have the nature ideogram of a pennant, which stands for God, and finally the sign for Medu, which means something like spoken word, speech, or something of that nature. Ancient Egyptians believed that words have a sort of magical power. They could influence and modify the reality, and even further, they could create life when life is apparently missing. We see here, for example, a funerary stele belonging to Nacht, which had the purpose of providing the deceased everything he might need in the netherworld, in the Duat. Then, word is a demiurgic tool and at the same time a way of communicating with God, communicating with the deceased. But a question, where do these things created by word takes place? I hope it will be clear in a while. Let's now move away for a while from ancient Egypt and let's focus on the key concept of this talk, the Mundus Imaginalis. What is Mundus Imaginalis? Well, first of all, let me state what it's not. Imaginalis doesn't mean imaginary, no fantasy. Mundus Imaginalis derives from Arabic halam hal mithal, which can be roughly translated as word of similitude, word of images, or something of that nature. And Henry Corbin coined this term Mundus Imaginalis to designate the sphere of reality, which was unknown in the Western world until that moment, stating that something doesn't really exist until it has been given a name or a definition. And it's interesting because it's not so different from ancient Egyptian philosophy in the end. Then, what is Mundus Imaginalis? Islamic philosophers such as Ibn Sina and Avicenna in the Western world, or Persian Platonists such as Suhrawardi, who lived in the 12th century, used to assume the existence of three worlds, three realms. First of all, the world of intelligible forms, or alam hakali, also defined as the world of pure intelligence. Then the realm of images, or realm of soul, our mate alam al-mithal. And finally, the tangible reality, or alam hissi. Hence, the function of Mundus Imaginaris is of being a medium between two, let's say, classical realm, the tangible reality and the world of the intelligible abstraction. In this framework, an image and the Mundus Imaginalis itself is something that dematerializes physical entities of tangible reality and at the same time gives shape to pure intelligible forms. As we will see later on, the product of this imaginative faculty refers to an imaginal geography, a landscape in the middle of the lower and the higher realm. It is what Persian philosophers and mystics defined as landscape of Svana, which is he depicted in these three wonderful paintings from Persian anthology. So, summing up this first part, Mundus Imaginalis is the landscape of myth, which is namely the landscape of human spirit, a landscape in which phenomenon really happen, and they keep happening through rituals and thanks to a proper dwelling in the sacred space. It has to be said that in Mundus Imaginalis, things do have shapes and dimension, and I think that this Flammarion engraving could well symbolize this fact. Beyond our physical and tangible reality, there's another reality which is dematerialized, but at the same time nonetheless perceptible and real. Sadly, nowadays, I think we are accustomed to a flat world in which space pretends to be homogeneous without distinctions or differences between places. My fear is that we have lost the meaning and importance of the notion of threshold. But anyway, world and space are not homogeneous. And ever since the spring of first human, people felt the need of respecting the cosmic order and gain a sort of superior benevolence. They hence start building axis mundi, or links between the earth and the supernatural principles that fuel the world. And in this framework, the essential feature of a sacred building is that of being an axis mundi, which determines the orientation of the surrounding world. I dare to suggest to avoid the distinction between inside and outside referring to sacred building in favor of a more complex distinction between lower or horizontal opposed to superior or vertical. And in this regard, I think that sacred space could be symbolized by a Mobius strip which doesn't recognize the opposition between two flat spaces. It's not a line dividing two equal important spaces, but it's a sort of tower or stairways towards the celestial world. I hope it will be clear that I'm not proposing any new theory about regarding ancient Egyptian architecture. As Umberto Eco stated here in Italy some few years ago, stata rosa pristina nomine, nomina nuda tenemus, which in other words means ancient Egypt is gone and we will never be able to grasp its real essence. We can just build theories based upon scientific or literal or mythologic evidence, but what I, what I am proposing is to apply a different way of seeing this scientific evidence, making use of notions originally pertaining to different cultures, but which I think they could help us in experiencing the ancient world, or at least the ancient wisdom. So let's come to Egypt. We shall now focus on two crucial myths regarding the afterlife. As we will see, ancient Egyptian tombs were crucial spaces conceived as crystallization of the ancient Egyptian view of the reality. The first cosmogonical narration pertaining to the theme of the death is the well-known myth of Osiris. And we could divide it into three parts. The first one relating to the dead itself. The second dealing with the action of Isis aimed to the restoration and the conservation of her brother's body. And then the final stage concerning with the relationship between the deceased and the livings. At the beginning of this myth, Osiris, son of tectonic and celestial powers personified by Geb and Nut, is killed and cut into pieces by his brother Seth. And as Ian Hasman properly stated, we have before us the first image of death, the dissection. And in fact, it is the physical decay and the corruption of the dead body are the first matters that need to be faced after the death. In the second part of the myth, whose complete version has been compiled by Plutarch, the attention is focused on the actions of Isis, the sister and wife of Osiris. Isis is responsible for finding and reassembling Osiris' dissecta membra, and after having found them all scattered along the Niles, and after having rejoined them, she gets pregnant. And as we can see in this depiction, she is copulating with Osiris' body in the shape of a bird. She will then generate Horus, which is here depicted, shaping what can be considered a circular time in which causes and consequences exist at the same time. And it's quite typical for this kind of narrations. This part of the myth become concrete in the actions that took place around the deceased. I'm talking clearly about the embalming and the mummification process. The aim of this long-lasting period, symbolically lasting 70 days, was to give the body its eternal shape. During the first part of the process, considered as a purification, the body was reassembled in order to overcome the state of dissecta membra inflicted by Seth. After the first transfiguration at the end of Isis, regarded to as a poetically crossing the lake, crossing the river, or something of that nature, the body was laid to rest in a bath of natron in order to remove all the fluid. And the final stage of this embalming process consisted of the modeling of the body by means of resin and gum in order to give the body an appearance of life. We have to notice that, and this is crucial, that for the ancient Egyptians, the mummy was a hieroglyph of the deceased. It was an image whose existence would be hopefully long-lasting and imperishable. Then the final stage of the myth of Osiris concerned the restoration of his public image by means of his son Horus. Horus takes vengeance for the murder of his father, defeating Seth in a trial and receiving the throne of Osiris. Once the physical integrity has been restored by Isis and the public reputation repaid by Horus, Osiris is finally redeemed and rescued from death, becoming Makaru, or true of voice. During the long-lasting history of ancient Egypt, the mythical concept of the deceased avenged by Horus underwent some substantial changes, mutating from victim to accused. The departed as to provide evidence of his innocence and to prove that the life he conducted has been in line with math, with the cosmic order. And this is what happens in this well-known depiction. The one we're looking at, for example, comes from the Book of Dead of Thais Nacht. And as we probably all know, the heart is, of the deceased is put on a scale with the feather, which symbolize the cosmic order of math. I think it's interesting to notice that pictorial depictions and hieroglyphic text perfectly melt. The symbol used to represent the heart and math are exactly the same used in hieroglyphic writing. And in this sense, I think we should and we could consider picture and text as one unique image and a sort of a cosmic picture. Moving on with the myth. If the heart of the deceased won't exceed the weight of the feather, the deceased will become Makaru, as we say, through a voice, and would be admitted to the netherworld. The second mythical narration, fundamental for the comprehension of funeral building in ancient Egypt, is that of the sun god Ra. In this myth is told about his journey through the afterlife aboard his two boats. The first one is Manjet, and it is used for daily travel, while the second, Mezektet, conceives the netherworld part of the journey, that through Duat. During its path along Duat, Ra has to overcome 12 gates and several perils, pitfalls, and enemies, among which is Apophis. This heavy snake is the embodiment of chaos and opposite to the math, and treats to stop the divine boat by swallowing the water upon which the boat is sailing. And curiously, but not so surprisingly in the end, it will be thanks to Seth that Ra could end his netherworld travel, since Seth pierces Apophy's womb, freeing the water and allowing the boat to prosecute in its journey. And at the end of his nightly travel through Duat, Ra will rightly completely renewed from the east. During New Kingdom, sarcophagi were often decorated with an image of the goddess Nut on the internal face of the lid. In this way, Nut receives his dead son Osiris and embraces him, becoming the feminine principle who received, protect, and generated the son, for whom she is tomb, necropolis, or broadly speaking, west where the sun goes beyond the horizon. We find ourselves in front of two apparently opposite images of death. On the one hand, we have death as an enemy to defeat, while on the other hand, death as a return to the mother's womb. Returning to the mother means becoming imperishable, getting part in an everlasting cycle of death and rebirth. And what could better explain and concretize this fact but the sun and this eternal path? In my opinion, Osiris represent in a way the paternal principle of redemption at the eyes of the community and the preservation of the memory, while on the contrary, Nut is the feminine element of returning home. Solar destiny, in fact, is the eternal and cyclic regeneration of nature and of the cosmic time. If on the side of solar destiny, the Great Mother received the deceased Henem in ancient Egyptian, embraces him and in a way absorbs him, on the Osirian side, the deceased become himself a declination of Osiris. He becomes the biological son of Nut. Then imitatio Osiridis and imitatio Solis become complementary interpretation of the death and of the complex system of ritual around it. The substantial identity between two apparently opposite conceptions is self-evident and in this sort of inscription from a coffin lid. We can notice that here Nut declares herself at the same time mother and tomb of the deceased. While saying I bury you a second time, it refers to the fact that Nut is the mother of Osiris, while in the latter that you may go out in among the imperishable star is an allusion to the solar destiny of Ra. So in the person of the deceased, the substantial identity between Osiris and Ra is achieved thanks to this kind of images. Another typical example of ancient Egyptian dualism lies in the notion of time itself. We say that we find ourselves in front of two different landscapes concerning the afterlife. First of all, we saw the destiny of Osiris of being rescued and redeemed by his family and becoming Makaru. And on the other hand, we saw the eternal cycle of death and rebirth pertaining to the solar destiny. If apparently these images are opposite, as I said, but they will merge, as I hope it will be clear in a while. Let's notice an interesting feature of hieroglyphic language. There are two words for time or for eternity, two different concepts of time and eternity. Time is nehek or eternal recurrence when associated to the eternal cycle of death and rebirth of Ra, while it is also jet or eternal monotony when assimilated to Osiris and his remembrance. So finally, let's move to architecture. Around 1530, King Ahmose defeated the Hyksos who were ruling on the lower part of Egypt. And he unifies Egypt, which would not be broken out again for at least 400 years. After this unification and after the expulsion of the Hyksos, used to choose for their burials the area of Drabu and Naga. In New Kingdom, royal tombs were moved to the brand new Valley of the Kings. As quite commonly in Egyptian history, the Valley of the Kings was chosen for two principal reasons, a practical one and a symbolic one. From the pragmatic point of view, the valley was a perfect place because of the ease of controlling the accesses to the wadi and so avoiding losses or robberies. But more interestingly for our side, it was chosen for some peculiar geographical and mythological features. When seen from the Valley of the Kings, and only from that specific point of view, the peak of Al-Khurna resembles a pyramid, which here becomes the archetypical mountain, the archetypical and cosmic pyramid. The peak of Dehenet, Safri Tuathor, which means forehead or something of that nature, is the personification of Meret Seger, which means she whom loves silence. Furthermore, the Theban plateau, when seen from the eastern bank of the Nile, evokes the shape of the hieroglyph used for the word horizon, the Achet. In fact, this valley is the place where the sun goes beyond the horizon at sunset and validating all its symbolic features. It's interesting to notice that this hieroglyph had another important connotation in ancient Egyptian architecture, being the reference for the construction of entrance pylon in New Kingdom temples. Since the rising of solar cult during the 5th dynasty, pylons become one of the crucial architectural elements of temples and tombs, resembling the shape of the hieroglyph for horizon, a sign that represents a point where the sun appears above the earth and where it touches the heart again at sunset. It has clear solar connotation. And in this framework, the temple becomes, thanks to the presence of the pylons, it becomes the Mundus Imaginalis in which the king takes part in his everlasting cycle of death and rebirth. It has to be noted that, interestingly, this specific glyph was not used until the 5th dynasty, when the official affirmation of the solar cult took finally place. It has to be noted that in the Valley of the Kings, the tomb in the Valley of the Kings were only one of the components of royal funerary complex. Indeed, the cult of the deceased was performed within the temples in the plain near the edge of cultivations. The funerary procession begins in the temple, often referred to as mansions of millions of years or something of that nature, and ended down in the Valley of the Kings, realizing the perfect ritual solar path. The coexistence of two funerary places respond to a precise need regarding death and afterlife. In fact, as we will see, for ancient Egyptian, there were two essential features to respect. On the one hand, as we saw before, it was crucial to remember the deceased and go on pronouncing his name. But on the other hand, it was essential and crucial to respect the mystery of death. And we have to remember that mystery was the key to the sacred. In the case of noble tombs, this was obtained in dividing the tomb architecture in two axes, an horizontal one corresponding to the need of preserving the memory, while a vertical one ensured the mystery and secrecy of the burial. Coming back for a while to the ritual path of the deceased, from the land of the living to the afterlife, such as the path of the sun, it is interesting to highlight that in funerary texts, such as in this one of Paheri, we find expressions like crossing the river or crossing the lake. Its symbolic value is striking. The city of Thebes, in fact, the city of the living, was on the eastern bank of the Nile, and the deceased ends had to cross the river to reach the afterlife and go beyond the horizon as the sun at sunset, to be ready to rebirth, completely renewed the next morning. And crossing the river finally means reaching the western hill, where the deceased will join the ground as called for in the first quote we see here. But let's come back for a while on mentions of millions of years. Surely one of the most striking example of New Kingdom mortuary temple is the Temple of Achebsut in Deir el-Bahari, whose former name was Jezru. I won't enter into details because I'm sure Professor Dodson would illustrate it far better than me on next Saturday, I think. But by the way, I will spend some few words regarding just its conceptual origin. This wonderful temple is located in a natural amphitheater lying directly before the Valley of the King. We can discern the peak of Al-Kurna lying there in the background of this picture. But within Jezero we could find the essential features of this kind of temple. The first crucial element is the sloping axis, which brings from the platitude of the secular world towards the Sancta Sanctorum of the sanctuary of Amun, to which the temple is dedicated. Along with Amun, it is dedicated to the goddess Hathor, to whom the entire valley is sacred. And in the southwest corner of this complex, we find the chapel of this goddess with its elaborated Cistercian columns. And in the northwest corner, we find the chapel of Inpu or Anubis, another important deity linked to the afterlife and the death. The Temple of Achebsut set an architectural pattern that would become a sort of standard during New Kingdom. In fact, we note the presence of the basic trichotomy of New Kingdom theology. On the right side of the innermost and superior part of the temple, we find the chapel and the court dedicated to the solar cult, while the sanctuary of Amun lies on the central axis. And finally, in the left side is located the chapel of the royal cult. The three crucial elements hence are the cult of the king and of his ancestor, clearly in the form and linked to the Osiris myth, the worship of Amun, and the cult of Ra and all its solar connotation. Summing up, we have three key deities crucial to understand the theology of ancient Egyptian afterlife. Amun, which is linked to the concept of invisibility and mystery, so as to be often called with epithets such as mysterious of form or something of that nature, and is a sort of chief god. Then we have Ra, the solar god, to which Amun is often linked in order to obtain the solar form of Ra Rakti. And we have already seen how crucial is this god in the conception of death. And finally, Osiris, who resembles the most human feature of memory of the deceased, a cult which refers to the king itself and his ancestors. Architectural feature correspond to the religious identity and aim of the temple. And the temple is conceived as a path from the secular to the sacred, and we could divide it into three moments or elements. First of all, it is an elevation path from the level of the plain to the higher one, consisting of the primeval mound concretized in the form of the temple, and then a consequent shift from layman to initiated before the gods. Then we have a transition from the east to the west following the axis of the temple, which resembles and concretizes the solar path. And finally, a transition from the light of Ra to the darkness of Osiris, from the blinding light of the Theban plateau to the darkness and the secrecy of the sanctuary. And let's now focus on the shape of royal tombs within the Valley of the Kings. First of all, it has to be said that ancient Egyptian history is much more complex than how I will depict. And even if I try to limit it within a precise era such as New Kingdom, but I think that in its long-lasting history, there are some crucial features that remain substantially the same. First of all, royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings consist of a descending path made up by ramps and stairways. This path should be seen as the axis of the tomb, its proper backbone. The second common feature is a couple of niches, and often quite close to the entrance, the so-called sanctuary where the east and west gods repose. These niches were crucial in order to give the tomb its ideal orientation, establishing clearly and once for all the position of the east and of the west. Furthermore, a striking example of ancient Egyptian double value of techniques and mythology, the cavern of Sokar. This deep well, which we can see in this picture, um, on the one hand resemble the cavern of Sokar, but on the other hand it serves as a sort of emergency space just in case of the entrance of alluvial waters that could entrap walkers inside the most internal part of the tomb. And finally, after the long descending path, one entered the Sancta Sanctorum of the tomb or the burial chamber. During New Kingdom, anyway, tombs were underwent a process of progressive simplification. Niches, for example, were often omitted without avoiding the ideal orientation of the tomb. And for another example, the cavern of Sokar ceased to be a deep shaft, but continued its existence in the form of a room. Among the most interesting example of the ability of creating spatial images are the arcade-style burial chambers. In this kind of tomb, the architecture of the burial chamber is itself a hieroglyph. The sidewall of the chamber have an arched profile that create a vaulted ceiling, and this feature, together with the central depression in which the sarcophagus is located, create a shape which perfectly resemble that one of the achet that we saw before. And it is not by chance that during this period, from the reign of Sethos I, new underworld books make their appearance, bearing the crucial value of the horizon. What is created through architecture is a structure that is a symbolic quintessence of solar renaissance. The incorporation of this symbol within the architecture of the Sancta Sanctorum of the tomb strengthened the feature of the tomb of being the physical creation of the solar path with its eternal cycle of death and renaissance to which the deified king is destined. Another interesting and noteworthy feature of this arcade-style burial chamber is the shape and decoration of the ceiling. If on the one hand the arched wall resembles the mountain profile of the arcade hieroglyph, they also shape the ceiling exactly as the hieroglyph for sky, which we can see here. This shape reflects the Egyptian understanding of the sky, conceptualized in the hieroglyphic script as a vaulted expanse supported by downward curving posts, which was often personified as the arched body of the sky goddess Nut, we can see in this photo. Then we cannot deal with private tombs today because this talk would be, I think, too long and probably quite boring for you, but I'd like to still use some few moments just to compare some schematic representation of different type of tombs. This section doesn't refer only to the famous pyramids of Giza, for example, but to royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. The major difference is that in royal burials of the former dynasties, pyramids were built in stone masonry, while in the Valley of the King, as we saw before, the pyramid was natural. It was the peak of the Henet. Clearly, there were much more and complex differences, starting from, for example, the different kind of text which shaped this space. By the way, in this scheme, we see that the limit between the secular and sacred world, the threshold which divide the land of the living from the Mundus Imaginalis of the tomb. And moreover, at the end of the descending path of the tomb, we find the burial chamber, the ideal concretization of the axis mundi, the ultimate vertical element connecting the earth to the sky. Concerning the private tombs, as we mentioned before, the structure was divided into two axes, responding to the need of secrecy and that of preservation of the memory. As we can see here, in this case, also we have a threshold, the crucial element of distinction between lower and upper world, often consisting of a pylon. Then the tomb is here divided into an horizontal layer where the pictorial depictions represent the life of the deceased, the action during his life, his accomplishment, and his good action, responding to the need of preservation of memory. And in this part of the tomb, we could find funerary stela, such as the ones we saw before, bearing offering to the deceased, and also false door linking the two walls. And then there's a vertical axis, which ideally links the underground burial chamber with the cult chapel, creating the proper axis mundi of the tomb. And finally, here we have the schematic section of the noble noble tombs of Saqqara. It's quite interesting, I think, to note that here, lacking the cosmic pyramid of Dehenet, nobles used to build a mud brick pyramid upon the cult chapel in order to affirm the clear solar connotation of the death, even for non-royal elite. And I think that for today, it's all. And thank you again for your participation and for your attention.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was great. Let me just change the screen here. That was really great. I've got loads of questions myself, but if anyone else has any questions, you're very welcome to ask them. You can either type them into the chat box or ask them out loud. I found that really interesting. There were loads of elements in there that I would like to explore more. One thing, I was reading an article recently about, I think it was actually about Neanderthals and other cave human species. And one of the anthropologists was saying that you shouldn't necessarily think that ancient people had the same concept of biological death that we had, which I thought was a really interesting point. And I wonder whether conceptualizations of the afterlife came from this idea of there not being such a thing of biological death, full stop, that, you know, perhaps their perception of time was such that they thought everything would return eventually, in the way that they see the kind of seasons returning and celestial phenomena returning and things like this.
Yeah, sure. In fact, that's Neanderthal cave were one of the most fascinating elements for me, because I think that they are the first attempt of human to say something like, I'm here and I'm not living just here. I mean, for example, why these Neanderthal, for example, decided to go in the deep of the ground with a lot of risk, for example, the presence of animals, just to make some depictions. I think that those depictions were an attempt to understand the concept of life. I mean, I think I dare to suggest that, for example, the cave of Chauvet or Lascaux in France are truly sacred space. I think that they were, in fact, axis mundi, even if probably lots of archaeologists or anthropologists would be quite horrified by this definition, because it is, in the end, a modern definition we put to a place which doesn't know about it.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot about Natufian culture and some of the cultures that predate the Egyptians, and there's evidence of a shamanic style burial in Natufian culture in ancient Jordan, I think, where a person was buried with, they were actually a middle-aged disabled woman that was buried, and she had various deformations of her spine and pelvis region, and she was buried with animals that obviously have a reputation for having particular powers and strengths. So an eagle wing was laid over her shoulder, and the hip of a panther, I think it was a panther or a leopard, was put in where her pelvis should be. And you could kind of imagine, I love imagining, like trying to imagine what ancient people experienced, putting myself in that time and trying to forget everything that I know now about the modern world and the kind of framework that I've built up in terms of what I think reality means. But I think conceptions of time are really an interesting thought when it comes to trying to put ourselves into ancient mindsets, because obviously ancient people did tend to think on grander timescales than we do, because they set their time according to celestial phenomena and seasons, and we tend to set our time by a 24-hour clock and a week and a year. So I think that time scale really deeply affects your perception of the world that you live in and your relationship with it. And even down to the like ancestor cults across all sorts of cultures, we don't have that kind of reverence for our ancestry and our ancestors and our lineage and our heritage. I remember I collect expedition accounts, and a lot of them are in the Amazon rainforest. And there was this beautiful story. It was about a group of explorers that contacted a tribe, and they'd only had one contact with the Western world before this, and that was through a group of missionaries. And the missionaries had shown them in the middle of the rainforest, the film The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, and in an instant they dropped their beliefs for this incredible magic and sorcery that they'd just been shown. It was like the most incredible thing that anyone had ever seen. And these expedition accounts are incredible because they're real explorers going into this territory, and they had photographs of the tribespeople before they'd had this contact, where they're wearing, traditional pieces of clothing, and they were all familiar with making food using the resources that were there. And then the next year you go in where they've been converted by the missionaries, and in the course of a year they were trying to wear three-piece suits in the jungle, and their entire lives had been turned upside down. But one of the interesting things they said as well was that these people had a oral history that went back to remembering the time when their ancestors crossed ice and snow wearing furs. And so that story had been preserved for thousands of years because their ancestors had crossed the Bering Strait to get into the Americas from Siberia. So really interesting how powerful that contact with our past can be, I think.
Sure, I do perfectly agree. My fear is that in modern day world, we have lost a lot of connection with the afterlife, because I think we basically fear death clearly, but I think we don't try to look at it under different point of view. I think we just believe that we die and that's it. Or if we have some religious mind, we could believe in the afterlife or something like that. But I think we do not relate with the death, and that's my opinion.
Well, I guess that's the result of living with this materialistic mindset, isn't it? Where something either is or isn't, and there isn't that in between liminal space so much anymore. And I think that it's possible that as we've evolved as a species, our ability to create these imaginal realms, to fantasize, to have perhaps what you might call out-of-body experiences or altered states of consciousness, our brain waves have more kind of consolidated in the alert alpha mode, and we are either asleep or awake, and there isn't that kind of isn't scope for that mind wandering that is necessary in order to have those unusual states of consciousness. I was reading a really interesting book. It was by two authors. One of them was Stefan Rossini, who I really love. And they were talking about the possibility that ancient Egyptian people experienced near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences, and that this may have been what inspired them with their ideas about the bar and the car and the soul and life after death. And I personally think that dreams are underestimated in this influence as well, because one of the common features of dreaming is that you will see people that have died in your dreams very often, and that would very likely inspire thoughts of there being this like afterlife, or this potential for an element of a human being to perpetuate into a different type of life.
Sure. And it's really interesting what Pavel Florensky told about dreaming, which is something that it is at the same time influenced by the perception of five senses, and at the same time influence the perception. in a sort of cyclic influence. For example, he told that once he was sleeping, and he had his head touching an iron bar of his bed, which was actually cold, and it was dreaming of being executed by cutting his head off because of this cold sensation of his neck. And he told that he was not sure if the dream went before or after the physical perception.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I have those kinds of experiences regularly, and I think it's very true that we are actually constantly processing sensory information, but it manifests as visual or dream content. And even down to things like internal processes that are going on inside your body, like people often, if they eat a heavy meal before they go to bed, have nightmares. And I think that minute and subtle sensations in the body can manifest as quite powerful dramatic dreams somehow. And I've spoken to lots of people about things like being too hot at night give you like quite violent war-like nightmares, even though the sensation itself isn't that dramatic. I think we've got a question here from Susan I should ask. Yeah. Oh, Susan, do you want to ask your own question, or shall I ask it for you?
I have a question as well.
Yeah. Do you want to ask yours?
Yeah, me?
Yeah, sure.
I find it very fascinating. Thank you very much, Andrea. The only thing I have is the concept of time according to Osiris, which is supposed to be eternal sameness through remembrance, and the Jed as eternal sameness, and the necessity for remembering. Remembering is also remembering, which is putting the pieces together. So in order to achieve this remembrance and the putting together of the fragmented pieces, it is important to actually not to defeat the object that caused the fight or the struggle, which is the essence of life. So Horus did not actually win the fight with Set. Horus had to reconcile, because in order to achieve this act of remembrance, you have to achieve integration first of the fragmented pieces. And the integration of the fragmented pieces, or the two fighting principles within ourselves, you really have to have reconciliation. So for integration to happen, you have reconciliation, and through reconciliation, you have the act of remembrance. And this is the eternal sameness, or the continuation of the same through the act of remembering. But I loved very much the way you joined the mythical construct of Ra with the mythical construct of Osiris through the time philosophy in ancient Egypt. I really love that very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm really happy with that. Thank you.
Does anyone else have any other questions?
Yes, me too. Yes, I do. It sounds to me like you're forgive me if I'm wrong, that you're saying that some of the hieroglyphs, which is something I've been thinking about for a long time, are not quite what they appear to be, and that there is something more to them in terms of this imaginal world.
Yeah.
And that absolutely fascinates me, because, yeah, I mean, it could be an entire construct, like the Hebrew letters, for example, some of the Hebrew letters. And I don't know, I'm just curious. Is it something that intrigues me?
Yeah, I am fascinated too by this fact, because I think that, yes, hieroglyph could be a sort of interface with something other, with another word, because they are at the same time basically a link between two words. And yeah, I think that behind every glyph, every image is a huge amount of sense and of meaning. And it's really fascinating. I do agree.
Can I say something about this?
Sure.
Yes, of course.
Can I say something about this? It's the language is pictographic, and they used a lot of bird-like shaped letters, because the birds have the capacity to fly, and they are the good communicators between heaven and earth. So in fact, as Andrea said, that the pictographic language lent itself to the imaginary representation, and what is represented becomes a reality. So therefore, the language was not just a means of communication. It actually had to represent the lofty ideas behind the written language. So the pictographs actually helped the Egyptians to represent their own ideas. And although it sounds primitive that you refer to a bird as a messenger between heaven and earth, but in reality, it is this ability of the bird to fly free of any constraints. So the language is not constrained in ancient Egypt. It has this kind of superfluous qualities that is beyond us to accept, or to see. And that's why in the Hermetic philosophy it says we don't simply write letters. They are powers, they are powerful words that carry intonations, that carry a specific message. And they were afraid of the translation and how the translation could actually distort the concepts behind the language.
And the pronunciation of the words as well, the sound would also be significant, and not making mistakes.
In agreement with Dr. Mervat, I believe it was the late period and the Ptolemaic period where the verb heni is used in Ptolemaic temples to describe the descension of the gods into their statues. And that same word is used with the determinative of a bird.
Oh, that's very interesting. I think it's a beautiful language, and it engages your mind in a very different way to learning any kind of language that uses abstract word or letter forms. There's something about when you see, obviously there's like some onomatopoeic types of words, but for example, like the word love and the use of the hoe in the word love, and this concept of like breaking up the ground and making the ground yield and making it ripe for taking and accepting seeds is very interesting to me. And almost any word in the language you can look at in that way, and it gets you thinking in metaphysical ways when you read Egyptian words, because you can't help but think about what the meaning is of the symbols that are within that word. And then obviously it has evolved from a purely pictographic language, and the phonetic elements to it and the determinatives and the complements have come a bit later on. So there's a kind of lineage of the language itself, I think, and it obviously becomes more and more complex as time develops, and then we have demotic and hieratic as well. So I think I was just saying to Mervat and Andrea earlier that one of the most brilliant things I've heard recently is this idea of the Egyptian government to reintroduce, or not reintroduce, but introduce hieroglyphs onto the curriculum there. I think it's going to be wonderful. And I think, you know, Egypt is obviously, with the mummies parade and things like this recently, hugely proud of their heritage, and this is going to be an amazing step for integrating ancient Egyptian wisdom into the modern Egyptian population in a kind of across the board type of way, because hopefully this will be accessible for all Egyptian children.
I have to say goodbye. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, Mervat, hope to see you in England in July.
I hope so.
All right, see you later.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Does anyone else have any other questions for Andrea?
No. Do you have an email that, because what often happens to me is I things percolate. I want to see this again and
Sure.
because I realized I was taking notes, and then I thought, this is crazy, because I'm going to get the, hopefully if I listen to it again, then I might have some questions.
Sure, I wrote.
We're going to be having a talk, I think it's going to be in September sometime, with Dr. Joanne Backhouse, and I'm very
she's great.
Yeah, she's been fantastic. She's done 2 talks with us, one on pre-dynastic women in ancient Egypt, and the other on women in Deir el-Medina. And she is planning a really great presentation on the symbolism and mythology and ideas about mirrors in ancient Egypt. And I'm really interested in this because I think that this idea of our image is really significant in a world where mirrors weren't ever present or glass wasn't ever present, and so your image was only ever observed in water or a polished metal mirror, and it's interesting how that might affect you. I'm intrigued by, I can't remember when it was, I think it was a medieval condition called the glass delusion, where when glass became much more frequently used as a building material, people started to believe that they were made of glass and that they would shatter. So it's interesting how these different technological things affects our psychology as a species. And I do think, I mean, you probably saw in that mail shot that I sent out recently, I had this idea of Hathor's libation bowl being a mirror of some, like a water reflecting mirror, because it seems so unnecessary that they would have done that small indentation circle in the middle, because that would have required a lot of work. So it was obviously meaningful to have that small indentation there. And Hathor is obviously associated with mirrors and is the daughter of Ra, and is implicated in the rebirth elements of birthing rituals, and is often depicted in postpartum scenes in ancient Egyptian art as well. So I'm really looking forward to Joanna's talk. That should be a really interesting one. But I think that this idea of seeing ourselves in a mirror, and especially in ancient Egypt, when mirrors would have been a bit more vague and less defined, our image, I wonder whether this is something that inspired this idea of this kind of upside down or sort of smoky other realm that existed on the other side, because you kind of can't rule out how powerful technologies are in terms of how we, form our conceptualizations of reality. Because, now that we're living in the computer age, everyone thinks we're living in a simulation, and creation myths from ancient Egypt and elsewhere often involve more sort of celestial origins or being made out of clay and things like this. So the technologies that we're using as a species tend to influence our creation myths quite a lot.
Well, that bowl, the bowl you were talking, that's at the British Museum, isn't it? Because it's very shallow.
Yes.
It's very, very shallow, and then it has this indentation. Yeah. And of course, the whole point about the mirror is that when you're looking at it, you're not really seeing yourself. You're seeing an opposite image, if you like. I wonder to what extent they would have understood that. Oh gosh, yes, the mind is sort of.
And if I recall, at least in Middle Egyptian, the word for mirror is ankh.
Yes,
the same word for life.
Exactly, yeah. And mirrors were associated with rebirth, so they have this kind of this reflective quality of life, obviously, and were obviously hugely significant ritual objects upon which a lot of time was put into making them and creating them, and they are really beautiful objects as well. So yeah, that should be an especially interesting one. What's coming up next? So next is Aidan Dodson next weekend. You're right, Andrea, on Saturday, and that's a 2:30 in the afternoon talk, because that's a Ramesses lecture. And then after that, we actually have kind of, if you've been interested in some of these themes, we've got Dr. Gregory Shushan, who's a comparative religion scholar, and he's going to be talking about potential near-death experiences.
Yes.
as influencing afterlife conceptions in ancient Egypt specifically. He started off doing ancient Egyptian archaeology, so he's kind of going back, and he's going to try to, there will be some other cultures brought into it, but I think it's going to be mostly ancient Egypt afterlife conception, so that should be very interesting.
Fascinating.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was wonderful. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely fascinating talk. Thank you, Andrea.
Really, really lots of ideas.
Yeah, we'll have to arrange a real life British Museum outing where we can all sit down and have a cup of tea and talk in real life.
Oh, yes. Or Petrie would be nice because it's a bit more
Petrie's tiny, we won't all fit in.
No, but it's a bit more intimate though, isn't it?
Yeah, I do like the Petrie Museum. It's great. Brilliant. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you all again.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you very much. Thank you.